and then so Lech Lecha in a nutshell. Lech Lecha literally means go to you. It could mean go for yourself, for your benefit. That's the way Rashi interprets it. Then you have other mystical interpretations, which is go the journey to you, a journey to self-discovery. But in any case, God speaks to Abraham, commanding him, go from your land, from your birthplace, and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. There, God says, he will be made into a great nation. Period. Okay. Abraham and his wife Sarai, accompanied by his nephew Lot, journey to the land of Canaan, where Abraham builds an altar and continues to spread the message of a one God. A famine forces the first Jew to depart from Egypt, where beautiful Sarai is taken to Pharaoh's palace. Abraham escapes death because they present themselves as brother and sister. A plague prevents the Egyptian king from touching her and convinces him to return her to Abraham and to compensate the brother revealed as husband with gold, silver, and cattle. Back in the land of Canaan, Lot separates from Abraham and settles in the evil city of Sodom, where he falls captive when the mighty armies of Kedar Laomer and his 3 allies conquer the 5 cities of the Sodom Valley. Abraham sets out with a semi-band to nephew, defeats the 4 kings, and is blessed by Melchizedek of Salem. In the bracket, they write Jerusalem. The word Jerusalem does not appear in the 5 books of Moses. It appears, of course, in the prophets, but not in the 5 books of Moses. The only possible and probable reference is in this parsha, Melchizedek, the king of Shalem. Shalem is the end of Yerushalayim. Many people think it's Jerusalem. In any case, God seals the covenant between the parts with Abraham, in which the exile and persecution, the galut of the people of Israel, is foretold. And the Holy Land is bequeathed to them as their eternal heritage. Still childless 10 years after their arrival in the land, Sarai tells Abraham to marry her maidservant Hagar. Hagar conceives, becomes insolent toward her mistress, and then flees when Sarai treats her harshly. An angel convinces her to return and tells her that son will father a populous nation the year. 13 years later, God changes Abraham's name to Abraham, father of multitudes, and Sarai's to Sarah, princess, and promises that a son will be born to them. From this child, whom they should call Isaac, which means will laugh, will stem the great nation with which God will establish his special bond. Abraham is commanded to circumcise himself and his descendants as a sign of the covenant between me and you. Abraham immediately complies, circumcising himself and all the males of his household. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short, in a nutshell. And now we can start thinking about the actual parsha and where the parsha takes us. So one thing to begin with is a question that many of the commentaries ask, and that is, so let's share the screen here for a minute. And that is that if you look at the parsha, the Torah opens up and with a commandment to Abraham. So I'll read the first few verses, Genesis chapter 12. And the Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your land and from your birthplace and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will aggrandize your name, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you I will curse. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed by you. Unbelievable blessings. You're going to become a great nation. Your name will be great. Everyone will know about you. Everybody will bless themselves by you. You have an unbelievable reputation. Abraham at that point is 75 years old. This is a question raised by Maimonides, but many other people ask the question, why does the Torah not say why Abraham would merit these great blessings? In other words, if I know nothing, I just read the Bible, I have no idea who Abraham is. I don't know anything unique or anything significant about Abraham. So why was he getting all these blessings? Just because he's willing to migrate? Many people migrate. Migration alone, the fact that he's willing to listen to God and leave, and leave his birthplace and go to a different land, that is not a reason to get these great blessings. So obviously, or perhaps, Abraham, there's a backstory. But how come the Torah doesn't give us the backstory? Now, if you look at almost every other figure in the entire Bible, every time the Torah will tell us about somebody, someone unique, someone significant, the Torah will tell us, before God speaks to them, the Torah will tell us something about how great that person was, why he earned that merit that God should speak to them. What is one example? One example is last week's Parsha. The hero of last week's Parsha is Noach. So in the beginning of the portion of Noach, these are the descendants of Noach. Noach was a righteous man, perfect in his generations. Noach walked with God. Okay, so we have a verse telling you Noach is a great guy. Tzaddik, he's righteous, he's perfect. We know this. Okay, now that you understand who Noach is, then the next verse says, God tells Noach, I want to destroy the earth because the earth was filled with robbery. Okay, but at least we know who Noach is. And almost everywhere in the Bible, when God speaks to somebody, there's always introductory verses about the person's biography, about who the person is and what the person was. But with Abraham, it doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. The question is why? It's missing. You can call it the missing biography. Now, it's not that we don't know about Abraham. We have many traditions about Abraham. And Maimonides quotes them at great length in his work of halacha, which is usually, well, he usually doesn't do that. But in the Mishnah Torah, the book of laws, in the laws of idol worship, Abraham and the Maimonides gives us the history of idol worship and talks a great length about Abraham, how he, through his intellectual inquiry, how Abraham discovers monotheism, and he debates the people of his land, and eventually they try to kill him and he has to leave, and that's when God tells him to go to Israel. And then you get the picture of this is not just a random person that God is saying, go to the land of Israel and I'll make you go to the land that I will show you and I'll make you a great nation. But you see that this is a person who sacrificed so much, first of all, discovered God and preached the oneness of God and sacrificed so much. And there's so much to talk about him. And like I said, Maimonides quotes it. It's in the Medrash, it's in the Talmud, it's in all the storybooks, it's in all the preschool classes. They tell everybody the full story about Abraham. The big question is, so why isn't it in the Torah? Why can't the Torah give us some indication of who Abraham was? That's the big question, known as the question of Nachmanides, because he's the one that spends, he's the one quoted with this question. What is the answer? So, of course, it's a Jewish question. There are many answers. So, Nachmanides' answer himself is I hate to say this with all the respect, not that convincing. I'm saying it because other people also disagree with his answer. They say it's not convincing enough. What does Nachmanides say? Nachmanides says that if you were to hear the whole history of Abraham, if a Torah will tell us the whole history of Abraham, that means the Torah has to get into the idea of idol worship and say that everybody was worshiping idols. And Abraham was the only one in the world who had to debate them and convince them that they were wrong. And in the language of Nachmanides, the Torah does not want to get involved in the foolishness of idol worship. So it's quiet. It doesn't talk the whole story, skips the first 75 years. Let's start from year 75 when God tells them to go to Abraham, to go to the land of Israel. That's Nachmanides' answer. Like I said, I think the question is better than the answer, but it's a good question, and that's his answer. Now, like I said, other sages did not want to did not agree with Nachmanides, and their principal objection is that you don't have to elaborate on the mistake of the idol worshippers to drop one word. Say something, one line, like with Noach. Noach was a righteous man. Say something that about Abraham that would tell you that this is a great person. So that just to say that the Torah doesn't want to elaborate on the story, because the Torah doesn't want to give credence to the opinions of the idol worshippers, it wasn't that convincing to some of the other commentaries. Another person to quote is Abba Bernel. He has a different vision. He says, look, he says that what does he say? I'm reading from memory. I think he says that everything that happened to Abraham up until that time, our stories are basically that they're not really miracles. In other words, it was all natural. It was natural. In this story, you start his relationship with Hashem. So it's a whole different ballgame. So we want to start with Hashem's protection of Abraham and Hashem's guiding him. And what happened till then, you didn't see any open miracles. That's if I remember correctly, that's what Abarbanel says. I apologize in speaking from memory. But then there are other interpretations, and the other interpretations say as follows. They basically say, I'm going to give first an interpretation from the Maharal of Prague, 16th century great sage and Kabbalist, and then I'll give you from Hasidic interpretation from the Rebbe. They similar ideas, just different emphasis. When you read about Noach and you say Noach was a wonderful guy, okay, fine. Abraham is the father of the Jewish people. The question becomes, what is the foundation? What is the foundation of being a Jewish person? You know, say Avram is our patriarch. Noach is not our patriarch. He's a great guy. We're all descendants of Noach. All of humanity is descendants of Noach, but he's not our patriarch. When you say he's our patriarch, you mean he is really the founder of our way of life and our relationship with God. So now the question is, what is the foundation for the Jewish people? Is our relationship with God, what is it predicated on? So imagine if a Torah would tell you Abraham is a great guy. He's brilliant. He asks the right questions. He did. He asked the right questions. He was able to go against everybody in his town, in his region, and ask questions and come to a different conclusion. Right? It's not very well known. Not everybody knows this, but the word Hebrew. What does the word Hebrew mean? In this week's parsha, Abraham is called Avram HaIvri, Abraham the Hebrew. It's not very common. He has, that's not the name used for the Hebrews. In the Torah, they're called Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. But there is no Israel yet, because Israel is Abraham's grandson. Israel is Jacob, who's Abraham's grandson. But in any case, they're called the Hebrews. What is Hebrew? So Hebrew comes from the word Aver, which means the other side. And the reason why it's called Hebrew is because when Abraham migrated from his birthplace and came to Israel, he was from the other side of the river. Which river? The River Prat, the Euphrates. So they said, Abraham, he's from the other side of the river. But the sages say, one second, it's not just that he was from a geographical area which is on the other side of the river. It's much deeper than that. When you say Abraham is called a Hebrew, why do they call him Hebrew? He's the only guy that came from the other side of the river. So the sages say because the entire world is on one side of the river, and Abraham is on the other side of the river. In other words, he wasn't afraid to stand separate and apart in his beliefs from everybody around him. So it's an unbelievable thing. Even today, it's an unbelievable thing because human beings, we follow the herd. That's what all the science says. We like to be like other people. It's very difficult to really stake out your own independent opinion. And it's different than everybody else. And Abraham is the one who, with his questions, he discovers God intellectually. And he's willing to argue with everybody else, to preach his opinions. He's willing to sacrifice endanger himself for his opinions. The king tried to kill him, according to the Medrash. The king threw him into the fire. Abarbanel says it means he threatened to throw him into the fire. But in any case, he sacrificed a lot for his opinions. He's certainly an extraordinary guy. Okay, if that would be in the Torah, what would I think? I would think that to be a Jew, the starting point is to be like Abraham. You have to be a person like Abraham to have the relationship with God. And what the Torah is telling us by omitting the biography of Abraham is that's not the foundation of the relationship between a Jew and God. Abraham may have, I'm sure Abraham discovered God, that's true, but that's not important for the story of the Torah, which is our story. What's important to us, what is the foundation of the relationship with God? Follow God's commandments. We don't know anything about Abraham. All we know is God told him something, he did it, and he was blessed. That's the story. That's what we have to know. That is our story. That is the foundation of our peoplehood. So yes, if you really are interested in the history of Abraham, go buy another book, go buy the Medrash, go buy the Talmud, and you'll figure out who exactly Abraham was. But in the Torah and the 5 books of Moses, you're not going to hear about the extraordinary life of Abraham, because then you're going to mistake and think that is a requirement for the relationship with God. In reality, the requirement is the relationship is built on the action on doing the mitzvah. And of course, as you well know, the Rebbe was always spoke about encouraging people to do mitzvahs. And when he started the campaigns of the Tefillin campaign and the other campaigns, women lighting Shabbos candles and putting up mezuzahs, so some people complained and they said, look, they said, before you ask someone to put on tefillin, before you ask someone to do a mitzvah, you have to stop them and take them into the yeshiva, teach them the Torah, explain to them the value of what they're doing. And once they understand that God exists, once they understand why you have to have a relationship with God, and once they understand the value of the mitzvah, then ask them to do the mitzvah. But to stop someone in the street where they don't really understand what they're doing and you say, do me a favor, put on tefillin, they put on tefillin, what value does that have? And in those years, in the 1970s, the Rebbe spoke about this verse, this story, the missing biography, Ramban's question. And he said, this is exactly what the Torah is telling you. The foundation is do the mitzvah. If I were to tell you Abraham's biography, that Abraham first discovers God, and only then did God ask him to do a mitzvah, yes, that was true about his life. But that's not true for our life. That's not true for the story of every Jew. So the foundation of our relationship with God is that we keep the commandment, and that creates and that sustains the relationship, but therefore it applies to everybody, not just to extraordinary people. One more twist to this question. One more to the twist to this question, another twist to the answer on this question of how come the Torah begins with the story of Abraham with Lech Lecha, is because, same idea, we start at the same starting point, which is it's not just the story of Abraham, this is the story of every Jew. So now we have to say the parts of the story that are relevant to everybody. And Lech Lecha, go to yourself, which means travel. And really, if you take the biblical Hebrew, Lech Lecha, it's a very interesting phrase. It doesn't translate into English. Go for you. Let's see how the ArtScroll translates it. Lech Lecha. Go. They translate go for yourself. That's based on Rashi. The Tovatcha, for your benefit. But that's not exactly what it says. It says go for you. And that's what the Hasidic commentaries explain. It means go to yourself. When you travel, when you're challenged, it's not just a geographical journey, it's also a journey for self-discovery. And that's what God tells Abraham. But more importantly, that's what God tells every person, certainly every Jew. And the Kabbalists explain that it has two meanings. Lech Lecha, journey for yourself and I'll make you a great name, is the story of the soul in heaven. God tells the soul in heaven to descend into this earth, which is a turbulent journey. And the purpose of the journey, even though it's a dangerous journey, but it's a journey that will increase the power of the soul, get the soul to greater heights, because once the soul is challenged and has no choice but to dig deeper and find the holiness and find the light even in a dark space. So its connection to God is intensified. So Lech Lecha, the journey is every soul coming down into this world, but also within this world, every person's journey, every person's life journey to self-discovery, the journey where life takes us, and ultimately it's a journey lecha, to our core, to our essence, to discover our true self, our true soul, and that is the story of every person. And because it's the story of every person, that's why we start with that. That's the relevant parts. You want the parts about Abraham specifically, you buy the other book, as we said. Okay, so that's one point on the verses Lech Lecha. Another interesting interpretation of this commandment and the emphasis that we're going to start with this as a foundational point. So there's a commentary from Rabbi Shamshon Fall here. She says something very interesting. He says you have to really compare this and contrast this to the previous story in the Torah. What was the previous story in the Torah? So last week, if I remember correctly, we spent some time of it on that story. That was the Tower of Babel. What's the Tower of Babel? All the people come together. The people decide we have to have one central city, one central project, and we're going to build a tower, and everybody's together, that unity. And like we discussed last week, that the unity did feel, it's not clear what was this great sin, and the Torah itself goes out of its way to hide the sin. But it does say that God saw what they're doing and it was no good, and He said, "Oh, yeah, we better stop them, otherwise, what they're trying to do is going to be successful." And God stops the unity and disperses them by changing their languages, and they're dispersed throughout the land. That's the last story, and then we have the story of Abraham. So you can read it as two separate stories that we read last week. This we're reading this week. But if you just read the Torah in order and you don't take a week break from Thursday to Thursday, you see that these two stories are very close to each other. And indeed, the Medrash says that Abraham was actually involved in the Tower of Babel. And there are characters here that reappear. Last week, we read about a great king named Nimrod. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babylonia, which is where the tower was. And this week, we're going to read about the battle of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. And the leader of the 4 kings is Amraphel. But according to the sages, Amraphel is Nimrod. They say his name Amraphel means associated with the idea that he tried to throw Abraham into the fiery pit. But in any case, you have Abraham versus Nimrod. According to the sages, Nimrod is trying to build the tower and the city. And Abraham is sort of the other side, the antithesis of Nimrod. And they have a showdown. I don't know, showdown. Last week, it wasn't a showdown. Last week, it was Abraham was disillusioned by the tower. And he goes away from that, separates from them. And he starts searching and starts doing his own thing. This week, they have another showdown, a military showdown, where Amraphel and the other 3 kings invade the land of Israel. It wasn't called the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. And they take Abraham's nephew captive. Why do they take Abraham's nephew captive? They're going after Abraham. Abraham goes to battle with them. So we have a sort of another showdown between Abraham and Nimrod. So these stories, at least if in the proximity, but also in the way the sages tell the story with the Medrash, which is that Abraham is sort of moving away from the Tower of Babel. These stories represent the idea that the Tower of Babel and the opening phrase to Abraham are sort of the antithesis of one another. So what's the problem with the Tower of Babel? I don't know. They go back to last week. So we said some interpretations, there are many more. One problem with the interpretation is that the Medrash explains that because they were so invested in the project of building a tower, so what happens is that the communal purpose and the communal project becomes more important than individual life. And that's the danger where you have a collective society, where we have a collective goal. And if an individual person is harmed, doesn't matter. We sacrifice the individual for the community. Medrash describes that they're building this tall tower, and they had the mechanism of lifting up the bricks. Spoke about the bricks last week. These are manufactured things. It's the modern invention because there were no stones in Babylonia. There's no mountains. There's no quarries, so you can't get stones. So they create bricks. So the brick is the iPod of the time. This is the height of technology. The Medrash describes that when they were sort of had their mechanism of wheeling up the bricks to the top of the building, top of the tower, in order to build. So if a person fell off, nobody cared; they continued working. But if a brick fell down and was destroyed, then they would sit down for mourning. You have to do shiva. A brick broke, and that's the way the Medrash depicts. The Medrash doesn't it's not proven in the verses, but it's the Medrash's way of saying that the problem with this verse is that when you become too collective and the individual person you lose regard for the life of the individual person and the values of an individual person, and you say that humanity only matters when we're all together and when we're united. In other words, only the collective matters, the individual doesn't matter. Doesn't matter in the sense that it doesn't have political rights, but also rights in the eyes of the gods. In other words, there's no moral consequence to the individual person's choice because the God doesn't care about the individual. God cares about the collective, not the individual. And that's the philosophy of the tower builders. And that's dangerous philosophy. That's the danger of collectivism if you take it to the extreme without any regard for the individual human right. But it's also morally wrong. And at least Rabbi Shamshon here says that you move away from that story and you go to the next story. And God tells Abraham as an individual, you go and you move and I will show you have a mission and your mission matters. And you have an individual mission and you can go up against the collective and you can influence the collective. That is the antithesis of the previous story. That's the correction of the previous story. So that's why we start with that, because that's so important to highlight. We want to highlight with this, so that's why we have an abrupt start. When you have an abrupt start, you start out of nowhere, you get people's attention. They used to have people come to the guy used to come to Chabad here to teach, to give parenting lectures, And he would also go to other places to give public speaking lectures. And the only thing I remember of what he said, which I never do it, but he said, you want to get people's attention, and it's a room and everyone's talking, and you have to get the microphone. You just start in the middle of the story. Whatever you want to say, just start in the middle of the story. Just say, and he went to his grandmother, and everyone's going to stop and listen. You start, once upon a time, I knew a guy who was 60 years old, and no one's listening. If you start in the middle of the story, boom, you got everyone's attention. Later, you fill in the details. That's what this gentleman said. I think that's what the Torah is doing. You want to highlight, this is a big deal. It's not just another commandment. God is telling Abraham as an individual, lech lecha, go for yourself. Not lachem, not for you in the plural, for you in the individual. You stand before God as an individual. You have meaning as an individual. That is the abrupt beginning that grabs our attention, and it's in great contrast to last week's story, the episode of the collectivism, but the collectivism at the expense of the individual. Whereas the Medrash says they mourn for bricks, but they don't mourn for people. So that is just another way of reading the importance of the opening of Lech Lecha, go to yourself. Okay, there's so much to say on this parsha. I don't even know where, there's so much to say. Literally every episode here, you could talk for an hour. That will continue. And if you have anything specific you want to talk about, please stop me. Otherwise, we'll continue down the journey and go through at least the general stories. And maybe I'll try to say a point or two, at least on the big ideas. Okay, the first thing that happens in Israel, Abraham comes to Israel. And remember, you got to put yourself in Abraham's shoes. Abraham comes to Israel, and the first thing that happens is, remember, somebody's coming, and he's preaching the name of God, which is a new thing. No idols, believes in monotheism. And what happens when he comes? He brings bad luck. Everything was fine in Canaan until, when everyone's serving idols, everything was fine, until this gentleman comes and starts preaching about God, and as soon as he comes, famine breaks out. Obviously, that's because the gods and the idols are not happy with this guy trying to come make a revolution. But no jokes, that's what happened. So he comes to the land of Canaan. God tells him, I'll give you this land. This land will be yours. He travels in the land, builds altars. We could talk about the altars. Verse 10. And there was a famine in the land, and Abraham descended to Egypt to sojourn there because the famine was severe in the land. Okay. So Abraham comes to the land of Israel, and there's a famine, and he goes down to Egypt. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? Should he have gone to Egypt? Should he not have gone to Egypt? So that is not a simple matter at all. There are different views. The person that takes the view, the strongest, that, okay, that's not what the sages. The sages say in the Medrash, you see, the Medrash says that the Mishnah says that there were 10 tests. Abraham was tested with 10 tests, and he passed all 10 tests. That's what the Mishnah says. What are the 10 tests is not clear. The Mishnah doesn't mention all the 10 tests. So that's why they have different opinions of what the 10 tests were. But most commentaries on the Mishnah believe when they enumerate the 10 tests, they count this as one of the tests that Abraham passed. What's the test? God said, go to the land that I will show you. I'll make you a blessing, and I'll make you a great name, and everyone's going to bless you for coming there. And as soon as Abraham gets there, what happens is a great famine. And Abraham is such a great famine that Abraham is forced to leave. So what would the natural response be? The natural response would be to complain or to question God. And Abraham doesn't question God. He goes to Egypt. That's the conventional, I would say the most traditional commentators will explain it that way. But then there's a big exception. I'm not saying he's the only exception, but he's a very powerful exception. And that's again, Nachmanides. Nachmanides leads the camp of people that say this was a mistake. This was not the right thing to do. God told Abraham to go to Israel, and he should have stayed in Israel. So there's a famine, so what? So you'll eat less. Did everybody in Israel leave? No, there probably were some people there who lived in poverty or was always very intense poverty. But you don't have to leave. And Nachmanides says that it was probably a bad thing that he left. It was a sin. And he says, a lot of people disagree, but he says that is perhaps the reason why the Jewish people later in this parsha, Abraham is told that the Jewish people are going to be enslaved in Egypt in a foreign land for 400 years. It doesn't say Egypt, but it says a land that's not theirs. So all of a sudden to Abraham, God comes to Abraham and says that your descendants will be foreigners in a foreign land 400 years. But why? What's the reason for the exile, for the Egyptian exile? What is the reason? The Torah, at least here, does not say a reason. Doesn't say the reason. Why do we have to be in exile in Egypt before we can come back? It doesn't say. Moshe alludes to an interpretation, but we're not going to get into that, what the reason of the exile is. The bottom line is it doesn't say it explicitly. Nachmanides says, well, the reason is because that is sort of a result of the fact that Abraham goes to Egypt as a sin. So that's sort of a punishment for that sin. That's Nachmanides' view. We mentioned this before, but Nachmanides believes that the purpose of all the stories of Genesis is to tell us it's sort of foretell what's going to happen with the children, with the Jewish people. Nachmanides didn't make up the idea. It says it in the Medrash. Ma'aseh avot siman lebanim. The actions of the patriarchs, of the parents, are a siman, are a sign for their children. But Nachmanides takes this idea and says this is the main idea of Genesis. And everything that happens in Genesis, he wants to show how this happens to the children as well. And if you look at this story, Abraham going to Egypt, yet Sarah being abducted, God sending a plague to save Sarah, and then the Jewish people leave, and then Abraham leaves with great wealth. That's exactly the pattern that we're going to read about in the next book, in the book of Exodus. The Jewish people are taken to Egypt. They go down to Egypt. Then Sarah is the equivalent of the Jewish people being oppressed. And then the plague that God sends to Pharaoh in this week's parsha, of course, corresponds to the 10 plagues. And just like on this parsha, in Exodus, God makes a big deal that the Egyptians are going to give the Jewish people tremendous wealth on the way out. And that's what happened with Abraham. So in other words, the story of Abraham going down to Egypt mirrors the story of the Jewish people going down and descending and then ascending from Egypt. That's Nachmanides' view. But Nachmanides ultimately says that it's a sin. Other people say the opposite. Other people say that the reason why they take the same principle that whatever happens to the patriarchs happens to the children, and they spin it the other way. Why does Abraham go down to Egypt? To pave the way for his descendants to be able to go down to Egypt and return unscathed and return with great wealth, spiritual wealth and wealth of experiences and wealth of spiritual fortitude. But in any case, they're saying the opposite. Nachmanides is saying that because Abraham went down, so that's what's going to happen to their children. But other people, I'm quoting, for example, the Al-Sheikh, who was a Kabbalist in the 16th century in Sfat, he flips it. He says, no, why does Abraham go down? Because Abraham senses that you have to go down to Egypt, even if it's going to be a difficult situation, but eventually you'll emerge. And if you do it, then that will sort of pave the way for your descendants to do the same. That's just a little bit of a sampling of what the commentaries are saying about the story of Abraham going down to Egypt. Was it okay? Was it not okay? The Hasidic interpretation, and this the Rebbe taught, the Hasidic interpretation is very interesting, and it goes like this. It says, the name of the parsha is Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha is go to yourself. In other words, journey towards self-discovery. But Lech Lecha implies not journey down, but journey up, right? It's an elevation. You're going higher. You're climbing. So the question is, if that's the name of the parsha, then the first thing that we read, Abraham coming to the land of Egypt, it says, Vayered Abraham Mitzrayim. Abraham descended to Egypt. Now, if Abraham descended to Egypt, then how was this in the parsha of Lech Lecha, of growing, of going, of elevation? In other words, we should have found a different name for the parsha. We should have said, call it the parsha of Abraham, just like last week was the parsha of Noach. This week could be the parsha of Abraham. No, we talk about Lech Lecha, the parsha of growth. And what's the first episode after God promises, go and you'll grow? The first episode after the growth is what? Avram descends. Seems out of character to the overarching theme of the story. But the truth is, from the Hasidic perspective, it's not. Because the purpose of the descent is to grow. In other words, in our journey, make no mistake, the journey is not linear. The journey is not like, oh, we keep growing, we come closer to God and we're blessed and everything goes fine. No, the journey, there are bumps in the road. And part of that journey, inevitably, before you're going to try to grow, you try to experience spiritual growth of coming closer to God and coming closer to your spiritual side, there's going to be a descent to Egypt. That's inevitable. But understand that experience of the descent to Egypt will also actually allow you to ascend with greater wealth. In other words, with a greater advantage. And what we get to is what the sages say, Yerida Tzarech Aliyah, the descent is for the ascent, and therefore the descent is actually part of the ascent. And therefore, Vayer Davram Mitzrayim, Abraham descending to Egypt, could be part of the parsha of Lech Lecha, of growth, of growing, go to yourself, of growth, because that's a critical part of growth is the failure, the challenge, and then overcoming that challenge and overcoming that failure. That's where the true growth takes place. And that's why as soon as he tries to grow, Vayera, there's a descent. And that's, of course, the story of every person. And therefore, we should not be dejected when we experience the descent, because that is actually an integral part of the process of growth. So let's move on a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about Abraham and his son and his nephew Lot and how they part. And later we're going to get to the part where the battle and Abraham has to come back from the battle, has to go save his nephew, and ultimately he meets the king of Sodom, the king of Salem, Jerusalem. So let's talk about the geography, the cities, what's going on about over here. We mentioned it in the past year, so I'm going to try to be brief. We touched upon this yesterday, but why does God want Abraham to go to the land of Israel? Why the land of Israel? It's the Holy Land, it's the Promised Land. Why? What's the value of the land? The joke was when we were growing up, today it's different because today they found natural gas in the water. But in the olden days, when we were growing up, the joke was that they complained against Moses, that Moses wandered with the Jewish people for 40 years, and he brought them to the only place in the Middle East that doesn't have oil, right? So why did he pick that piece of land? What's the uniqueness of that piece of land? There's all kinds of interpretations. You have the spiritual interpretations, you have mystical interpretations, you have geographical interpretations. I mentioned yesterday that there's one that it seems like Moshe highlights that one. And basically, in Israel is a land that you're dependent on the rain. It's not a land, there are some lands that don't have no rain at all, okay? There's some lands like in Egypt, at least the fertile part of Egypt is the place where the Nile is, so you don't need rain, there's no rain, but you don't need rain. And the sources of the Nile are in Africa with this abundance of rain. So you always have the financial security of the water that comes with the water. Then Israel is this funny place where you don't have rivers, we don't have great rivers. You need the rain, but the rain is not so common. So what do you end up? You end up with a person that needs to raise their eyes heavenward and knows that they're dependent on the blessing from above. And that's a good place to be, spiritually speaking. That's conducive to spirituality, because if a person feels that they don't need heaven, they don't need a blessing, they're totally self-sufficient, so it's very easy for them to come and believe that their success comes from their own power. And if you want more information about this, read the entire 5th book of the Torah. That's basically the reoccurring theme in the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to come to Israel. If you're too successful, you may forget about God. But this notion that you have to look up to God, you have to look up for the rain, that is something that keeps the human ego in check. Okay, so what happens? Abraham comes back from Egypt, and he has his nephew, and his nephew, they get into his people. His shepherds get into a fight with the Lot's shepherds. And basically, Abraham tells him, we have to separate. If you go left, I go right. If you go right, I go left. Look at this beautiful verse, verse 10. And Lot raised his eyes, and he saw the entire plain of the Jordan, that it was entirely watered, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Here, ready for the quotes? Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you come to Zohar. That valley that Lot sees, the Jordan Valley, now it's maybe not now, at least the southern part of it is completely dry. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, is completely dry. But in those days, There was a tremendous amount of water there. Kula mashke was all water. And then it says, it's like the land of God, like the land of Egypt. And when you hear those words, what do you sense? Is the Torah telling you that it's a good place or a bad place? When the Torah says Egypt, the Torah doesn't really like Egypt. Yes, so in material abundance, it's like Egypt, but in morality, it's also like Egypt. And it's no surprise then that Sodom actually descends and becomes a place that is morally corrupt, as we'll read in the next parsha. But in any case, that's where Lot wants to go. Now, and we say verse 13, the people of Sodom were very evil and sinful against the Lord. And then once they separate, God tells Abraham, okay, I'll give you this land for you. And he reiterates the promise in verse 14. And the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had parted from him, please raise your eyes and see from the place where you are northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your seed for eternity. Why does God reiterate the promise? He already told him a few pages ago when he first came to Egypt that he's going before he went to Egypt, that he'll give him this land. So many of the commentaries believe that what's really happening here is that God is waiting for Lot to depart to reiterate the promise, meaning the land will go to Abraham's descendants, not to Lot, his nephew, because at that point, Lot was his only heir. In any case, what am I saying this? I'm just saying this, that if you look at the verses, you see that Abraham wanted to separate from Lot, but he didn't want Lot to go to Sodom. Where do you see that in the verse? Even though he doesn't say it explicitly, it's verse 9. And it is, please part from me. If you go left, I will go right. And if you go right, I will go left. Now, if you go through the Bible, what is right and what is left? So south is right. Even in Hebrew, the word Teiman comes from the word Yamin, is south. And I learned yesterday that the word in Arabic for left, for north, is smal, which is left. In other words, the orientation is toward the east. That's where the sun rises. And in the Bible, when you say right, you mean south. There's verses in the Tehillim, Safon v'yamina tabarata, you created north and right. Because we're facing east, and right is south, and north is left. So when Abraham tells Abraham is on top of the mountain, on top of the mountains of Judea, sort of the border of Judea and Samaria, and he tells Lot, you can go right or left. You can go north or south. If you go north, I go south. If you go south, I go north. What does Lot do? Lot looks east. And he wants to go to the place that was like Egypt. Why is he in love with Egypt? He was just coming from Egypt, if you remember, right? Sodom was like Egypt, but they were just coming back from Egypt. To the extent that I heard a theory that says that why did Abraham go down to Egypt? Because his nephew really wanted him to go. And his nephew, he was loyal to his nephew, because the whole history of his nephew is another story. Abraham's brother was killed also because he followed Abraham, and Abraham was protecting his nephew. And that's why later on in the story, Abraham risks his life to save his nephew. But some people say that it's not written explicitly, but the first part of the story where Abraham goes down to Egypt is also because his nephew doesn't want to live in Israel where there's a famine. He'd rather go to Egypt, and consistently he's choosing the place of Egypt. Okay, fine. Now, let's talk about for a moment about the notion of the war, the battle between the 5 kings and the 4 kings. So in the past, we discussed at great length what exactly happens here, why there's so many kings, why they're all fighting. Maybe we'll get to it also, but let's start with something else. Let's start with the after the war. After the war, Abraham is successful. He redeems. He frees his nephew who went captive, and he redeemed all the possessions of Sodom and Amorah that were taken captive. And Abraham and his people return everything to the king of Sodom, and they have this conversation. If you look at verse 17 in chapter 14, verse 17, and the king of Sodom came out toward Abraham, after his return from smiting Kedar Omer and the kings who were with him to the valley of Shaveh, which is the valley of the king. And Malki Tzedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest to the Most High God. And he blessed him, and he said, "Blessed be Abraham to the Most High God, who possesses heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, who has delivered your adversaries into your hands, and he gave him a tithe from all." Who gave who a tithe? So the verse is not clear who gave who the tithe, but I'm pretty sure Rashi says that Abraham gave him, right? And he gave him, i.e. Abraham gave Malki Tzedek a tithe from all that was his, because he was a priest, right? It says he was a priest, who kohen la'el elyon. Now this is surprising, because we read about Abraham, and we read about Abraham as the founder of monotheism. And all of a sudden, we hear about a person, he wasn't in Iraq and Turkey where Abraham was born. Maybe in Abraham's born, where in the place that Abraham was born, nobody heard about this guy. But he comes to Canaan, and here we have a city, Salem, Shalem, complete. We have a king of that city who is a priest to the Most High God, which we assume is the one God. And it has to be the one God, because otherwise Abraham wouldn't give tithing to that person. Wouldn't give 10% of the everything he owned. So, and he's blessing God, and he's blessing Abraham, and he gives him Meiser, he gives him 10%. Abraham gives him 10% of everything he has. So who is this figure, and who's this fellow, and what does he know about God? And if he knows about God, why isn't he more of an important figure in the story? It's almost like an afterthought. He's just here as a supporting cast member. He's just here to tell you, oh, Abraham, he was there when Abraham came back from the war. But who is this guy? How come he's not preaching the oneness of God? And what does that tell you about Abraham? What does it tell you about the differences of understanding about God, understanding God between him and Abraham? So just bringing this guy into the picture makes us wonder, who is this guy and how is he different than Abraham? So there are opinions about that as well. And here we go. Okay. So here is a commentator that says as follows. Commentary that says as follows. So you have here, what do we know about this guy? We know his name is Malki Tzedek. What does Malki Tzedek mean? Two words. Malki is Melech, the king, and Tzedek is, I don't know, justice. Tzedek is justice, righteousness. He is the king of justice. Malki Tzedek, king of justice. What a beautiful name. He's a king of a place called Shalem, complete, wholesome. So we have complete justice, complete righteousness. Beautiful. Why isn't this Judaism? Why isn't he the father of the Jewish people? Why isn't he the patriarch of the Jewish people? So we have to think about something about what he's saying. Where is the flaw in this wonderful king who is a priest? He's an important priest. He knows about the one God, because otherwise Abraham would not give him 10% of the produce of everything he owned. But yet he's not part of our company. In other words, he doesn't fully understand the concept of monotheism. So is it alluded to in the verse itself? So if you look at the verse 18, 19, and 20, there is one phrase that keeps reoccurring, and that is the way he refers to God. El Elyon, Most High God. Now, there's nothing wrong with saying Most High God. In fact, we say it in our prayers every day, 3 times a day, 365 days a year, sometimes 4 times a year, 4 times a day, right? Kel Elyon, the Most High God who does great kindness. There's nothing wrong with referring to God as Most High God. He is the Most High. He is elevated. But when you see that pattern, right? Verse 18, Most High God. Verse 19, Most High God. Verse 20, Most High God. He keeps referring to him as Most High God. The first time and the only time that I know of in the 5 books of Moses that this phrase appears. And here it appears 3 times in 3 verses in every single interaction with, every time you mention Melchizedek in the entire story of Melchizedek, it says 3 times Kel Elyon. So what does that tell you? So that is a hint to tell you the problem with this philosophy is that God is Most High. God is removed from this world. And yes, there is a God. There is a God, maybe above all the other gods, who believes in justice. And that's why he says Melchizedek, he is the king of justice, because to him, justice is a value. But he believes that the God of justice is, number one, removed. El Elyon, he's supernal God. He's not supposed to be everywhere. He can't be everywhere because in the domain of the physical world, there are many other gods and many other values and many other competing interests. And therefore, yes, we're going to sort of make a space. He's going to be a priest of a high God. He's going to make a little town called Jerusalem, which was a tiny town. It wasn't even a town. There were a few homes. Even in the kings of David, even in the days of David, it was very, very small. So we're going to sort of make a little place where we serve the Most High God. But Abraham is not about the Most High God. Abraham is about understanding that God is the only power and God is everywhere. And therefore, the values of justice have to be throughout the world, not just in one limited physical space. So take this where, you can elaborate upon this, but it's fascinating to see that the Torah is alluding to the problem by offering his praise to God, which is true. El Elyon, supernal God. Yeah, but if you highlight the supernal too much, that's a problem. Abraham's point is that God is everywhere, God's on earth, and God is everywhere, and therefore there's no room for other idols. It's not that God is the true, ultimate, first cause, but then there are many other gods and many other values. No, Abraham says that God is the only God, and that's the big difference between Abraham and Melchizedek, and therefore Melchizedek understands the oneness of God, and therefore understands that God is the most powerful, and therefore Abraham acknowledges him as the priest of God, but he's not what we would call Jewish. He doesn't have the monotheism that Abraham has. Okay, 4 more minutes. I want to talk about one theme that is an interesting theme, just because it's about commandments as a whole. We're going to talk about the first commandment that, I don't know if it's the first commandment. It's not the first commandment to Abraham, but it's the first commandment to Abraham that applies to the Jewish people as well. And that's, of course, the commandment of circumcision, which is the end of the parsha. But I'm not here to talk about circumcision per se. We're really going to talk about circumcision and how circumcision, being the first mitzvah to Abraham, the first mitzvah that applies to us, how that's sort of gives us the theme of all other commandments. So let's look at the verses of circumcision for a minute or two. We'll spend 3 minutes on this, and we'll see where we get. So we keep mentioning the word briti, my covenant. Maimonides counted them. He says there are 13 times the word covenant is used in the context of circumcision. Covenant doesn't stop at the covenant. Okay, let's see. Okay, so let's, for example, look at verse 10 and verse 11. So verse 10 reads as follows: "This is my covenant, which you shall observe between me and between you and between your seed after you, that every male among you be circumcised." Okay, circumcision is the covenant. Beautiful. Very nice. Verse 11, "And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be as the sign of a covenant between me and between you." This is already a different story. Is it briti? Is it the covenant? Or is it a sign for the covenant? Now, this is significant. What's the difference if you say it's the covenant or the sign of the covenant? If you say something is the covenant, you mean the act itself makes the connection. If you say it's a sign for the covenant, the act itself doesn't make the connection. The connection is the idea, the spiritual bond. The act reminds you of the spiritual idea. It's a sign for the covenant, but it's not the covenant. right? So I would say that briti, if you say that the circumcision, but by extension, every mitzvah, a mitzvah is the covenant. A mitzvah is what creates the covenant. That's one story. That's what verse 10 says. Verse 11 says the mitzvah is not the covenant. That does not make the connection. It's a reminder of the connection you already have, or a spiritual connection. So which one is it? Is the mitzvah the act of circumcision, or the act of putting on tefillin, or the act of eating matzah, or the act of sitting in the sukkah? Is that the connection? Is that the brit? Is that the bond? Or is everything we do, we have a spiritual connection with God, and we have a spiritual connection, and the act is here as a reminder, as a motivator to help us meditate about the spiritual connection, but it's really the brit is really the spiritual bond, and the action is only a reminder of the spiritual bond. So which one is it? It's contradictory. So one answer is we're getting contradictory messages because both are true. There is a bond. The mitzvah has the double value. The mitzvah is what connects you to God, number one, first and foremost. And that's why that says it first. Zot briti. This is the covenant. The mitzvah connects you with God. In addition, there's also what is the message of the mitzvah. After you do the mitzvah, you ask yourself, what is the message of the mitzvah? What could we learn from the mitzvah? What is the spiritual idea behind the mitzvah? And that is the second verse that says, Ot Brit, the mitzvah is supposed to be a sign. It's supposed to tell you something. It's supposed to teach you something. But that's not the entire value of the mitzvah, the message behind the mitzvah, or the meditation behind the mitzvah. The meditation behind the mitzvah is secondary. The mitzvah itself has its own value of creating the covenants. In other words, they're both true. Every mitzvah we do is both a covenant and a sign for the covenants, meaning it's both. The act itself creates the connection, but there's also a meaning behind the mitzvah that the mitzvah is supposed to remind us of. Both are true. Which one is primary? Well, for that you have to come on Fridays and read the Tanya chapters. What are we doing? 30, 30, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. Now we're studying 41, so we just finished that subject. But mitzvah, the action is primary. The intention helps inspire the mitzvah, helps raise us, helps us more be cognizant of the purpose of the mitzvah. In the language of the Tanya, the mitzvah builds the home for God. The intention beautifies the home. So home has two parts. It's got the structure, it's got the ceiling, protects you from the elements, but you also want it to be beautiful. And the intention and the meaning behind it makes it beautiful. So that's the story in short, but it's important to understand this about every mitzvah. Just the mitzvah itself is the bond. The mitzvah also has a message, which is the sign of the bond. Okay, there's a lot more to say on this parsha. So we can only wet your tongue. And now you could spend the next 2-3 days studying the parsha, and until Sunday, which will go to next week's parsha, and God willing, in good health next year, same time, in good health, we'll continue studying this parsha. In the meantime, the journey continues. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.